Okay, calm down.
We have our next guest who is usually based in Bethlehem. She's in the States now, which means that she can talk to us because late night on the East Coast is not a convenient time when you're in Palestine. So we're going to bring on to the show Yumna Patel, who is the Palestine news director for Mondo Weiss. Hi, Yumna. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So tell us the latest news coming from Bethlehem, from the West Bank, Gaza. What are the big stories that people need to know about?
I hate to say it, but I think it's a lot of the same of what we've been seeing, just escalated. So, I mean, over the course of Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, we saw dozens of Palestinians rounded up during Israeli raids across the West Bank, including in Bethlehem. So, you had the Israeli military raiding the birthplace of Jesus and arresting Palestinians from that place on Christmas, which the irony is not lost there, especially since Christmas festivities in the city were canceled out of solidarity with Gaza and essentially in mourning from the Palestinian community there. So raids are ongoing in the occupied West Bank. The raids are becoming more and more violent. It's very clear that Israel's shoot to kill policy, which has existed for decades, is being escalated to a degree that many haven't seen in decades, perhaps since the Second Intifada. Israeli forces are staging mass destructive raids on refugee camps, cities, and towns in the occupied West Bank. They're shooting people dead. Over the past few weeks, we've seen videos come out of Palestinians essentially being um, extrajudicially executed in the West Bank during Israeli military raids. And of course, that also carries over into Gaza on a much more massive scale. The big stories that we've been seeing unfold just over the past few days alone have been of essentially these detention and torture camps where dozens, hundreds of Gazan men and boys are essentially being taken, kidnapped, stripped of their clothing, and kept in these detention camps. When they do make it back, it for those who are lucky enough to make it back. For those who do make it back, they report very harrowing stories of torture, sexual harassment, sexual assault, verbal abuse, physical assault, starvation, deprivation of water as well. So really, really horrible things are happening in Gaza in addition to the massive bombings that are nonstop. Just yesterday, I believe Israel carried out what many people are describing as a massacre in the Al Maghazi refugee camp, which is in the central Gaza Strip. So we're 81 days, I believe, into this genocide, and every single day it becomes more and more apparent um, from the footage that we are seeing Israeli soldiers film of themselves that Israel is carrying out a genocide, and the horrific images that we're seeing in Gaza are, you know, could be straight out of a history textbook of genocides that have been carried out in the past.
So let's take a look at some of these images. Let's see. We have this image of young men and boys. The tweet is from Haneen Hassan, says, "Zoom in because no, you're not confused." And that is a quote tweet of a tweet by Rami Abdul saying, "Field executions, mass detentions, alarming footage of Israeli forces turning a stadium in Gaza into a mass detention camp. The
Mhm.
video shows the detention of hundreds of civilians, including women, elders, and babies." And here's that footage, and you see these men in the field, the stadium.
Apparently, um, this video compilation that we're seeing now was first published allegedly by an Israeli journalist or reporter that's embedded with the Israeli military, essentially a montage meant to show the military activities, which is what was described by the Israeli military when it responded to reports of these videos and condemnations of this particular video. The Israeli military called it basically routine military exercises and said it was well within the parameters of international law. But as that screenshot from Haniyin's tweet showed us, they're among the men, old and young, including disabled. There are also boys stripped down to their underwear with their hands up, um, underneath, under the guns and tanks of Israeli military. And right there at the end, um, you see an Israeli soldier holding a bundle of a blanket that allegedly is a Palestinian baby in Gaza, and there's not too much information on who that baby is, where they came from, what the circumstances were. But this video has really been making the rounds on social media over the past 2 days. Al Jazeera did a report about it as well, because it's not the first image that we've seen like this, as you know, over the past few weeks. So many images exactly like that one of rows and rows of men and boys lined up, stripped down to their underwear, their hands up, being surrounded by Israeli soldiers in various detention camps, essentially being created by the Israeli military inside and outside of Gaza. So this is just the latest such camp that's been established.
People have pointed out that it's reminiscent of what Pinochet did with the stadium in Chile. So,
Mhm.
where, for instance, Victor Jara was killed. We have some more tweets that you shared.
So this is a screenshot also from that same video, but it's basically just to put into perspective like the scale. And I think images like this are just very shocking. I've seen tweets from people say these are essentially a lot of these images are identical to the way that Bosnian men and boys were rounded up and before they were executed during the genocide in Bosnia. Um, and so I think images like these are really important to see because those zoomed away, when you do zoom in some of the other shots that we saw, there are elderly men there, um, disabled men, boys, and dozens of civilians who have just been stripped, not only of their clothing but of every basic human right and dignity. And Israel is essentially saying that it's well within their rights to do this because they're suspected of terrorism. So this is a video published by Al Jazeera, where Palestinian prisoners are speaking of the torture basically in Israeli detention centers. So if you go back, you can see at the very beginning of the video, they're showing their wrists, and we've seen lots of images of this. And basically, whatever the Israeli soldiers
Right
tied
there, we can pause it.
these men's hands with has essentially dug so far into their skin, that it's caused these terrible scars. We've also seen images of some men's hands like completely swollen. Basically, after the circulation was cut off to their hands because of how tightly they were bound. And you can continue to play the video. You'll also see men showing on their bodies places where Israeli soldiers put out lit cigarettes onto their bodies, creating different scars. Some of these men talk about how they were just constantly hit and hit and hit. They were beaten if you didn't do exactly what the Israeli soldiers said. One man said that the Israeli soldiers ordered them to bark, and if they like dogs, and if they didn't bark like dogs, then they were beaten. If you were beaten and then you said, I'm sick, I can't take it, they would beat you more. These prisoners were deprived of food and water, and this man here is saying that, they were given dirty water to drink, some hallucinogenic substances that caused them hallucinations. They were also tortured with electric shocks and were basically starved
Mm.
of food and water. It's really horrible stuff. This is just one video of many, many videos that we've seen that outlets like Al Jazeera have covered, and that human rights groups like Euromed Monitor have actually released reports about, basically saying that there are horrific conditions being faced by Palestinian detainees, essentially in what they call torture camps and detention camps. And they've also reported that Palestinian civilians who are being taken captive have been summarily executed as well in the process of being taken to these torture camps. You have this man, this Al elderly man here in this interview with Al Jazeera. He says that he was held for about 30 days. And in the first, I believe, week to 2 weeks or week to 10 days, he was only given water. He was not given any food. And then he was fed one cucumber a day or one apple a day. And it was essentially the soldiers alternated between feeding him a cucumber or an apple. This man that comes on screen now, he talks about how he was beaten and how Israeli soldiers said, "Oh, where do you want us to hit you, or where do you want us how do you want to be killed?" And he said, "Okay, I'll be a martyr." They said, "You know, we're not going to martyr you." They just tortured him and they made him wear diapers because they wouldn't let him go to the bathroom, so he had to soil himself. And so again, these are like one, two, three, four testimonies of hundreds, maybe thousands, and it's really, really harrowing stuff, and this is happening constantly. So in Gaza, not only are Gazans being bombed constantly, but civilians, mostly men and boys, are being taken. They're being taken from shelters, from different schools where people are sheltering. They're being taken from their homes, and they're being sent off to these detention camps and torture camps where they're being severely abused, and some of them have even been executed.
Awful. And you hear people, you'll see on social media something like this will be tweeted out and they'll say, "Well, they were Hamas."
Mhm,
Or what can we do? They all wanna kill, unfortunately, October 7th.
mhm.
Like, there's nothing Israel can do that will a lot of people, there's literally nothing Israel can do that will make them say, "Okay, this is problematic."
Right, and it's really scary because how long can you go on, claiming October 7th as a justification for what's happening? We've far surpassed the death toll of,
Right.
um, 20,000 according to some rights groups. Um, Thousands and thousands of children have been killed, and like you see here, we are seeing people being detained en masse and tortured, and in that first screenshot that we saw, those are boys in their underwear being held up at gunpoint and being held up by tanks. So what crime have they committed, to be treated like this? And so, we're 81 days into this. So many human rights experts, genocide experts, and researchers have said this is a genocide, is a
Mhm.
textbook genocide, from the aerial bombardment to the torture camps to the executions to the starvation, the deprivation of food and water, to the open calls from the Israeli prime minister and Israeli officials to carry out an ethnic cleansing and send Gazans into the Sinai. And yet every response, or a lot of the times the response that we get is, well, October 7th. So,
Right. October 7th, or there's this other kind of shocking response, I think, which is like, it's not genocide because if they wanted to, they could kill all of them, like, in one bomb. Like, I've really heard people say that. Like,
yeah,
anything short of the total annihilation
right.
of Palestinians is, like, almost generous.
Right. Exactly. It's like, well, we could drop a nuclear weapon on Gaza
Right.
if we wanted to, but we're not. So somehow that means that we're being humane.